Welcome everyone to NSTA Web Seminars, where you find live interactive learning at your desktop. My name is Flavio Mendez and I'm the Assistant Executive Director for the NSTA Learning Center. I will also be moderating today's program. Today's program is titled NGSS and STEM, Two Converging Paths, presenting my colleagues from NSTA, Wendy Binder and Tricia Shelton. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And our first presenter will be Wendy Binder, who is our Program Director for Integrated Programs. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you, Flavio. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to say a little bit about myself and then why Tricia and I decided to do this webinar topic. So I'm a Program Director in Integrated Programs. I work specifically with some large programs that are grant funded, all for STEM integration K-12. So I sit in a STEM world at NSTA, immersed in what are the best practices, the best models, and the best ways to infuse our science education with the practices of science, technology, engineering, and math in support of workforce skills. And I'm going to advance the next slide to say a little bit about my world and really what the driver is. So I know most of you know about Rising Above the Gathering Storm. It's back from 2007, and it really set a call for not only focusing on science education, but focusing on technology, engineering, and math, and the ways we can integrate them in order to provide our students with an education that prepares them for the kinds of jobs that are out there and the kinds of jobs that will be out there in the future, because it was felt that prior to this we really were falling short of that. So NGSS really came to be in a time when the call for STEM was out there. Many programs were emerging. I mean, when I went to our conference in New Orleans this past week, I walked the floor of the exhibit hall and was amazed at how many programs are STEM-oriented. So STEM is really quite the catchword. And NGSS came into being while STEM was getting a foothold. So the emphasis in NGSS around the practices of science and engineering, which came out of the framework for K-12 science ed, really led me to start thinking about what is the relationship between STEM and NGSS, and what can we learn about their differences, and what can we learn about the relationship between the two. And Tricia, I'm going to advance the next slide, 1 second. Tricia came to NSTA a short while ago. She has been a high school biology teacher for 22 years in Kentucky, passionate about creative thinking skills, preparing students for success in the 21st century, just like the call in Rising Above the Gathering Storm. She's won numerous awards. She came to us and became our standards implementation specialist. And Tricia sits in an NGSS world. And I often interface with her in our work, and I went through her NGSS training, and in talking with her, we felt that this topic might be of high interest to people like us, educators, that are looking for what is the synergy with NGSS and STEM? How do I talk about both of them at the same time? And NGSS has really laid the groundwork for that conversation because it's based on 5 innovations. And innovation 2 is really where I sit with STEM. That innovation is about engaging students in explaining phenomena and designing solutions. So with NGSS creating this terrific vision about how children should be learning science, it also supports how to prepare them for the workforce. So I'm going to pass it to Tricia. She's going to give us a little bit of an intro into 3-dimensional learning, and then I'll come back on and insert some comments about STEM to take us on our journey investigating the relationship between these two education initiatives. So I'm passing it to Trish.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was a great introduction, and I am really super excited to be part of this webinar, and it is so wonderful to work with Wendy at NSTA and to be able to bounce ideas off of her, because what I'm hoping everyone will see is that the NGSS that was built on the latest research on how kids learn, combined with the STEM initiative, packs a really powerful punch. So that is what I'm hoping to discuss today. And that one of the biggest innovations in the NGSS is called three-dimensional learning. So I would love if you would be willing to self-assess and share what your understanding of three-dimensional learning is. So I'm going to turn it over to Flavio for the poll.
Thank you, Tricia. I've shared already the tool, so you can select your clip art. Remember, it's the very last button on the toolbar. And select your clip art and place your clip art in the area within the continuum where you think you are. Figuring out where to start with regards to three-dimensional learning. Are you maybe in the middle, building my toolbox? Or, like it says there on the right, you're ready to roll. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and self-assessment. I'll be turning it back to Tricia.
Thank you so much. And if you're still getting your clip art on the continuum, I'll wait about another 10 seconds for people to indicate where they are in the continuum. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. Wendy referenced that call for that need for STEM. So I'd like us to consider the evolution of communities, in this example, particularly the farming community over the past 100 years. The NSTA Press book, Creating the STEM Culture by Jeff Weld, describes the likely bewilderment that a time-traveling farmer might feel if they jumped 100 years. And if we consider the picture on the left and compare that to the picture on the right, even one of our nation's earliest economic segments, the transformation of agriculture in the information age, has been quite noteworthy. From the computer-controlled robotic assemblers in the John Deere factory to the innovations and technology available to support the day-to-day life of a farmer, access to technology and knowledge has transformed our world. In just about every aspect of society, we can see the effects of this knowledge economy, where knowledge is free, except maybe in education. So I ask you to consider, looking at these two pictures, have classrooms and has the way that we approach instruction changed in the last 100 years? And that same book, that NSTA Press book by Jeff Weld that I referenced, the STEM culture book, as it describes, the world doesn't care about what you know. It cares about what you can do with what you know. So if we consider, have our schools changed approaches to instruction to support the collaboration, rapidly adaptive, and problem solving needed to compete in today's information and technology age? So with that, I'd like us to consider these thoughts as review a short video about why we need to rethink education in the U.S. With an NGSS perspective. So Flavio, if you could please share the link in the chat box. And participants, as you click on the link, please view the video and then return back to the webinar. And I'm going to ask you to share some of your thoughts about this video when you return.
Thank you, Tricia. Let's ask everyone first to click the away button so that we're going to go away to watch the video. I'm going to place here the link on the chat window for the video. Just click on that link that you see there in blue on the chat window. It will open a separate browser window on your computer. Watch the video. When you're finished, come back and click the away button again. Good luck. Okay, if you finish the video, when you return, remember to click the away button again to indicate that you're back here with us. I see maybe there's just a handful of people who are still finishing watching the video, so we'll wait just a few seconds for them. Okay, Tricia, let's go ahead and go on to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Flavio. So I'd really like to hear from you. What resonated with you about this video? What did you see or hear that you consider critically important to education in today's world? So if you could please share that, your response to that in the chat box. I see answers coming in. Science is about problem solving, connected to the real world, much different from that teacher to student. Teacher is the holder of the knowledge and using instruction such as lectures. I love the share that the thought of our science is outdated and never really thought about that. I love that last part at the end when the little girl asked if the internet was invented. That's a question somebody could certainly ask me. Learning in ways that are applicable, connecting to real life, lessons being applicable to the real world, teaching students to think like engineers. Lots of comments about being prepared for that, the real world and that next step, opportunities for students, authentic learning. Problem solving, applying to various learning styles, how we need to consider how to teach today's students. And one of the reasons I love that video is the student voice and the teacher voice and the parent voice all in that video together in connecting to the need for real life applications in preparation for today's world. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about that video. And I think that really sets us on our trajectory about how NGSS and STEM can intersect and be a pathway for making those shifts in education. So I'm going to turn that over to Wendy, our STEM expert, so she can frame this video and this thinking in a STEM lens.
Thanks, Trish. And I'm going to throw another question at you before I do the next slide. And I just want you to reflect to yourself for a few seconds about this. If you feel like you would really like to write something in the chat room, please absolutely do that. But because there are so many definitions of STEM out there, if you could just think for a few seconds to yourself, what does that mean to you? And perhaps you are implementing STEM in practice or working towards that with your school or district, but just what does that mean to you? And if you'd like to shoot anything in the chat room, please feel free, and then I'm going to put up a definition that I've come to really love. Okay, so I wanted you to think for a few seconds before this one because this has a bit of a twist to it. So as you're reading it, I'm hoping you can see what the twist is that speaks to some of the things that were brought up by Trish, especially with the farming analogy, but also what I said about that early report on the gathering storm, excuse me. This is a definition from a book that Trish has already referenced that sits on my desk and I reference constantly. It's our new press book called Creating a STEM Culture for Teaching and Learning by Jeff Weld is the editor. And what I love about this definition is that it goes further than any definition I've seen because it puts in that the contexts that make the connections real, which you all just stated from that video, really need to be between the school, community, work, and global enterprise. In order to make sure that we are producing a literate workforce that can excel and succeed in future jobs. That combination of school, community work, and global is a really important piece to this definition. So I wanted to share that with you. So for STEM, what is in that definition, he talks about being STEM literate, STEM literacy, and what really does that mean? And what it means, there are 4 specific literacies, and these literacies are STEM subjects, but they all have their core set of competencies or disciplinary literacy. And those are all important in their own right, but to become STEM literate, students have to have the ability to use concepts from each of those competencies and apply them to understand and develop solutions to real problems, which you all just said was really important. So becoming STEM literate is not easy. It means really combining those competencies and having students apply them to solve problems. So when I say STEM students, I've been on a quest to put together adjectives, descriptors. So what do we mean by that? And really when you look at this, I know Trish would jump in and say to me, well, Wendy, those are NGSS students, and they are. This is what the vision for science education today is. We want a student to have all of these characteristics when they leave us so that they are successful in the workplace. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm sure you've read them already, but I'd like to link it to the practices of STEM. In order to be that kind of STEM student, you must be exposed to these practices. Now, these practices that I've listed here are slightly different than the way the science and engineering practices are listed in NGSS, and I did that on purpose because you're going to see STEM practices listed differently everywhere. Everyone is putting out their version. But I like this set, and I think it is completely in alignment with NGSS. One of my programs, though this is going to look like a bit of a strange slide till I explain it. One of the programs I work on, I'm fortunate enough to work with Northrop Grumman, and I interface with their engineers because part of that program is a mentorship where teachers I work with all year spend 2 weeks in the field with engineers and technologists. And I was in the field with a particular engineer here in Maryland. And when I asked him, well, Steve, what exactly do engineers do? I know you use the design process, and I've put it in this slide. It's on the right. The EDP exists in different forms, but basically it has the same components of going through a process to solve a problem. And this is the list that he gave me, and I loved it because it's unusual. He said, we follow patterns, we collect and analyze data, we do use computers to model systems, and he told me they basically use computers for all of their modeling. They do try experiments, they use the data to keep them on track, they adapt, persist, and they never have enough time to finish what they want. To be in the presence of an engineer applying their skill is a treat. And I encourage all of you, if you have links to your communities, to go and interview an engineer or bring one into your classroom, have your students interview them, video conference them, because their work and what we think engineers do are not always a connect. So that's why I wanted to share this with you. My next few slides are from Change the Equation, an excellent source of data around STEM and actually science education in general. And I'm sure you're adjusting your eyes to this slide, but I will explain to you that that red in the middle is showing you that 63% of students are exposed to engineering through family. That's why this is called by accident of birth. 63% are learning about engineering from family members. The light blue all the way to the right, currently 13% attribute exposure to engineering from teachers, which is why it is so important that we join in the exposure to engineering to help the workforce. So we're adding to what they're learning from family members. So it's not just who you're exposed to, but it's engineering education for all students, not just where they are born into, the family they're born into. And the next slide is on technology, and it's very interesting, and you probably could predict it. 37% of the students are learning what they know from friends or teaching them, from teaching themselves, because they're digital natives. They're growing up in the world with technology, so they're teaching themselves. They're also learning from family, but from teachers, it's higher than engineering, because I think we've done a little bit better job of bringing hardware into the classroom, but we haven't done as good a job of bringing engineering technology into the classroom. So these slides are here. You can borrow them from the slide deck. They're in our collection to share them, because I found these extremely riveting when I saw them. And the next one is also from Change the Equation. And this is a nice segue to the next part Trish is going to do about next generation science standards. And you can see at this graph, the states that were early adopters have caught up and surpassed other states in terms of their students being able to tackle engineering challenges. NGSS, by virtue of the vision of NGSS and the inclusion of the science and engineering practices as one of the dimensions, coupled with the cross-cutting concepts and disciplinary core ideas, sets up those students brilliantly for succeeding in engineering design challenges. The last slide I have right now, I forgot I have one more, excuse me, is a slide I also love. I put this together because STEM really is the glue for the practices in all of the disciplinary core competencies. So this gives you the list of science, engineering, tech, and math. Alone, each category are excellent practices, but together, integrating STEM is extremely powerful. And I love the way that NGSS does that. And Trish will lead you through some slides to show you that engineering is across the three dimensions and is in all of the core ideas, the cross-cutting concepts, and the practices. So with that, I'm going to pass it back. Actually, we have a question slide, sorry. So Trish and I have said quite a bit to, we hope, get you thinking and questioning and wanting to comment. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and Trish and I will address them, and then we'll move on to the next section.
Thank you, Wendy and Trish. So to our participants, just take a moment and type your questions in the chat window. We have 2 or 3 of these pit stops for questions along the way. I see a first question from Jocelyn. How about STEAM? So I guess I'll have maybe Wendy first address this. Where does the arts go? Wendy, can you respond to that first?
Sure. The art goes right after the E and the before the M. No, that was my joke for the night. Sorry. So art has a very easy, beautiful role with STEM. Many districts are moving to be STEAM because art has been the place where students have been the most creative and problem solving within that medium. So it's a nice tool for STEM and a nice integration opportunity. So I know that I'm talking a lot about STEM. I certainly could add art to those practices. So I could think about doing that for the next time. But STEAM is really a way to move towards becoming a transdisciplinary school or district where all of the subjects are integrated around a common theme, and students are applying their skills from art, science, math, engineering, tech to solve a problem. And I think that art is naturally embedded when students have to present their solutions in different ways, and they often do it in a very artistic, creative way. So I hope I'm answering your question. I'm not sure. I think it has a place. I think it is done naturally, and many schools and districts have moved to use the acronym STEAM instead of just STEM.
Thank you, Wendy. Tricia, would you like to add to your comments about STEAM?
Thanks, Flavio. The only thing that I would add, and this is just to remember what Wendy said, I live in an NGSS world, and I appreciate STEM very much, but NGSS is more my wheelhouse. But I look at both of them as really emphasizing interdisciplinary connections. And so others have told me that the STEM initiative is interdisciplinary, and that the acronym letters came from the needs in the economy, and that all of the other courses in a school can support that initiative, and the arts would certainly be one of them. So it's my understanding that the acronym was never meant to leave anybody out. It was to pull everybody together, and think back to the video when it talked about the huge growth in jobs in the STEM field. And so when I think of the acronym STEM, I more think of that job workplace connection and how all of the disciplines can support that initiative together, including arts and others that we haven't mentioned here.
Thank you, Trish. Let's see if we can look at Christina Robbins' question with regards to 4 or 5-year-olds. Do you think this is too early to begin STEM activities or lessons? Wendy, what are your thoughts on that?
They're not too young at all. I think that STEM should be starting at pre-K. I think that it's natural, it's easy, they're building, they're creating on their own. I don't know if anyone is as old as I, but when I was teaching elementary science, we did it through whole language. Worked very closely with the language arts department, and we had students as young as 4 and 5 creating things around a common theme, such as eggs, and building things, and we were doing egg drops, and they are not too young. And there are terrific books out now for getting STEM going at young ages. They're never too young for it. And if you'd like some resource suggestions, I can put them in the chat window as Trish is talking.
We'll take one more question now from Rosina, which had to do with ideas to integrate STEM if there are no supplies from the school. Any thoughts? What resources exist that maybe you can recommend?
I think Wendy is willing to share, and she, I'm sure, has a wonderful collection of resources to share in the chat box. And I love that question because one of the classroom contexts that I'm going to share has to do with where the students were presenting their design prototypes, where one of the criteria for success was that they had to use readily available supplies or things that they could bring in from their household. So you will see that tonight in the webinar.
Thank you, Trish. So let's go ahead and move on, Tricia, with your segment on NGSS.
Thanks, Flavio. So the intersection of STEM and NGSS, we probably have some people on the webinar that are possibly more informed about the NGSS, and those that are more informed about STEM, and then some wonderful experts on both. And so our goal of describing possible intersections between STEM and NGSS really is embedded in how we can better prepare in education students for success, career success, and empower them for opportunity, but also success as citizens, and the ability to thrive and make decisions in our really fast-paced, globally connected world as well. So in considering that intersection between STEM and NGSS, both of these initiatives move students from passive recipients to active constructors of knowledge and solvers of problems, and that can empower them for success in today's world. both of them also have a large focus on inquiry. So let's consider many of these discussion points, and especially inquiry, and build on that emphasis of inquiry that started in the 90s that was the first attempt to shift classrooms from passive to active. So this emphasis point, the classroom shifts suggested in this webinar are based on a growing body of research, including research in neuroscience that was only made possible in the last few decades through technology. This new way of thinking about science education also builds on many of the great endeavors and improvements that go back decades. So as you take a look at this quote from the framework for K-12 science education, that is a free download, by the way, and we also have it linked in our NGSS at NSTA hub. But if we take a look at this quote, if you could please share in the chat box, what do you notice that is different about this new vision of science teaching and learning? How is it different from standards of the past and initiatives of the past, as described in this quote? What word, what phrase resonates with you as being different? This new vision for science education. I see a share that it explicitly includes engineering. There's a discussion of the cross-cutting concepts, which in the NGSS world is the third dimension. Those are the thinking tools, the way that students organize and connect their thinking. There's a limited number of ideas. The emphasis on revising knowledge over time. Building and revising that knowledge again. So we see a lot of the same pieces that are resonating as different. So the framework in the NGSS didn't just throw everything out that we had built that was that were good, solid pedagogy and education, but it instead extended on them and especially leveraged the technology and neuroscience research for us to use that research along with research in cognitive sciences and about student learning to design a vision to empower students. And one of the key innovations of this vision are the 3 dimensions. And those 3 dimensions are the science and engineering practices that we call the SEPs, the cross-cutting concepts, or CCCs, and disciplinary core ideas, or DCIs. And so when students are working on solving design problems or explaining things in their world, they're using all 3 of these dimensions together. Flavio, at the beginning of the webinar, shared a collection. So Flavio, if you could share that link to the collection again, and Flavio just put that in the chat box. And one of the handouts in the collection is a document about the 3 dimensions. So I would love if you could, if you have that available, if you could pull that document up. And we're going to briefly overview those three dimensions. What we really want to focus on tonight through some examples from the classroom, and we'll get to, again, hear student voices engaged in this work, are the 8 science and engineering practices, which are on your handout, and if you printed it in color, in blue. There are 7 cross-cutting concepts. Again, these are the thinking tools, ways for kids to organize and connect their thinking, which is very different from past standards, and it's very empowering for students. So one of the ways that we can approach STEM through the NGSS is by elevating these 3 dimensions in designing instruction, including these cross-cutting concepts. And then as mentioned in the chat box, we have disciplinary core ideas. These are the science ideas, and you can see that engineering and technology has been elevated in these standards to be equal to life science, physical science, and earth and space science. And the other innovation is that we are emphasizing depth here. Instead of a whole bunch, they are key science ideas that are broad and critically important to explaining the world, and also the foundation for solving problems in our world. And so for me as a teacher, that was a breath of fresh air, that my kids could dive deep into these science ideas instead of having to cover so many in such little time. So how did students build this understanding that many of you referenced in the chat box that is built and revised over time? I love this graphic organizer from nextgenstorylines.org, and it shows that students are engaged in explaining the world, and we call that those events in the world phenomena, by asking questions that are driving the learning. And they're figuring out the answers to those questions by engaging in the science and engineering practices. And what they figure out are pieces of these science ideas that they can use the cross-cutting concepts to connect together and end with new questions that further engages them in their exploration and contributes to this evolving understanding. And so again, remember, one of the innovations was this integration in addition to this revising and building of knowledge and elevation of engineering design. So we can almost think about it as Inquiry 2.0. And in addition to the STEM Culture book edited by Jeff Weld, this book, Helping Students Make Sense of Their World Using the Science and Engineering Practices, is a wonderful addition, wonderful resource as well. And it frames this new vision of teaching and learning as student sense-making, or making sense of the world. And that sense-making happens when students are engaged through these 8 science and engineering practices. So Wendy and I would like to elevate them in the conversation today. And if we zoomed in on our graphic organizer from NextGen Storylines, we would also see that they are often used in combination with one another as students act and think like scientists and engineers. So let's consider a classroom example. I'd like you to think to yourself, as you watch this very brief video, what practices are these students engaged with? So Flavio, if you could please put the link in to this very short video, and you guys will be, this time when you use the away button, you'll probably be back pretty quick.
Thank you, Tricia. Let's everyone click on our away button now. And we're going to share the link here to the video in the chat window. There it is in blue. Click on it, and you open on a separate window, watch it, and then come back and click the away button again to indicate it's finished. Okay, if you're back, just go ahead and click on the away button again to indicate you're back. Tricia, I see that there are about a handful of individuals still away. Just give them about 10 seconds, and then you may continue. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my mic.
Thanks, Flavio. And I see some shares in the chat box that these students were engaged in the science and engineering practice of modeling. So in this example, the students were using a model to make sense of something in the world. So let's take a look at an additional handout that we provided in the collection, and that digs deeper into this science and engineering practice of developing and using models. And that is one of the tools. This is from the appendix in the NGSS, which is obviously available free online. Here at NSTA, Ted Willard has also edited a book called The Quick Reference Guide. In this particular handout series, where you have the progression of each of the 8 practices that shows what it looks like at the K2 grade band, 3, 5, 6, 8, and at high school. Since we called out that what you just witnessed, the students were developing and using models, let's flip to that particular part of the handout, several pages. So it's going to be on the back of page 1. And let's consider this last column here, and that is the column in high school. And there are 6 bullets in this column. And those 6 bullets describe what developing and using models looks like at high school. So before I give you a lot of information about what the students were trying to figure out, I'd like you to watch an additional short video taken a little bit later in the process in the classroom. And as you watch this video, I would love if you would even circle on your handout which of these bullets, or you can say, I see evidence of multiple bullets, which of these bullet points at the 9-12 level do you see evidence that the students are engaged in or using these elements as they are trying to understand their phenomenon in the classroom? So Flavio, again, if you could share the link, and different parts of the video have different students using these different models. And I would like you to think about, are these students engaged in the practice of developing and using models at the high school level? How many of those 6 bullets do you think you see evidence of?
Thank you, Tricia. This video is about 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Here's the link. I'm placing it on the chat window now. Click on it. We'll go silent. And again, make sure you click the away button to indicate you're going to watch the video. And then click the away button again when you return. Thank you so much for your cooperation. Okay, as you return, remember to click on the away button again to indicate that you're back. And we'll wait a few seconds here for everyone to return. Okay, Trish, I think most people are back.
Thanks, Flavio. So what you probably have discerned at this point is that over the course of several days, the students in my classroom used models to build an understanding of the components and interactions of the urinary system. Also keep in mind that you may have heard some inaccurate analyses, and that's okay. The students were actively working towards this understanding of the concepts, which would come with additional testing and analysis and discussion. So think back to that innovation of building and revising and understanding. So if we look back at our Science and Engineering Practices handout series packet and consider developing and using models, one of the things I asked you to do after you viewed the video is if you could indicate how many of these 6 bullet points do you think that students were engaged with that you saw evidence of in the video. And so if you would be so willing and type that number into the chat box, anywhere from 0 if you didn't think you saw evidence of them engaged in any of these, to 6. And so if you could please type that into the chat box now, that number, how many of the bullets did you see evidence of in the video that the students were engaged in about this practice? So I think people are taking some time to read through those bullets, and I so appreciate that. I found so much information, great information to plan and shift my instruction in these appendices, which are now you have the entire practices appendix in your handout in the collection. I see a lot of 2s, 3s, and 4s coming in. So the purpose of the students were asked to either create a video that you could see their faces and hear them talk about the series of models that they used, or they could just send an audio, a piece of audio evidence of that discussion. And that's what I used for my formative assessment to see not only what my students understood about the science ideas, but also how they were engaged in the practice of using models and discussing that with their peers. So if we look at this slide, here are some consensus responses. You see that when we've shown this video around the country, and thank you to that group of young men that has so graciously allowed us to share their video for us to have a contest to talk about education. So we thank them very much. But there has been some consensus around these 3 particular bullets, which we also call elements of the dimension of developing and using models. So you can read through there and see if you agree with that consensus. So many people feel that the students were engaged in evaluating the good points or merits and the limitations for 3 different models in this case, and also using those multiple models to be able to explain a phenomena, in particular this system and how the components of the system work together. There's evidence that students were also engaged in some of the other, or at least partial of the elements. So if you had other answers, I'm sure, I feel certain that you could defend those answers as well. But using multiple elements in instruction correlates with a deeper understanding of those science ideas. So one of the big takeaways from this first section is to hopefully reacquaint you or introduce you to the appendices where these elements are, and to ask you to consider looking and using at multiple elements as you design your instruction. So at that point, I'm going to turn it at this point over to Flavio for our question break.
Thank you, Tricia. Let's give our participants a little bit of time to digest the information and share a couple of questions for Tricia.
I see that Don brought up a really good point in the chat box, and he can read my mind. He knows where I'm going with this, that we were focused on that 9 through 12 grade band, but they actually were doing some pieces possibly of grade bands below them, especially when it comes to some of the bullets or some of the continuum towards the bottom of that page. And so we're going to get to that in just a little bit further into the webinar.
So Valerie asks, how do you take students who aren't used to making models and problem solving into doing these things? Tricia?
That is a really great question. And that's actually on the next slide, but I'm going to go ahead and, because the next slide is just a visual, and we'll go ahead and answer it now since Valerie has asked that. But the way that I would describe that is what students were doing, and they were using their understanding of the practice of developing and using models, but they were making their thinking visible. And the understandings that they had that they were making visible were gained from the use of models. But they were doing this sense-making, remember, that we've been calling it, because they were trying to figure out a phenomenon, an observable event in the world, which I kept back from you up to this point. But what they were trying to figure out is how a healthy teenage football player died from drinking water and Gatorade, which they just could not believe that anything like that could possibly happen. We were engaged in this unit at the beginning of the school year during football season, so they were quite motivated to develop an understanding of how this could happen. And so thinking back to the video at the beginning with the younger students and the older students being really engaged in engineering and solving problems, the same thing happens on the science end of that, the science and engineering practices. And that happens when they are engaged and excited about developing an understanding to something that they can observe in the world. And so that is a big innovation of the NGSS that can hold really, really well with STEM, is that, and builds on inquiry. Remember our Inquiry 2.0 is we want kids to be asking questions about events in the world and then design units around those events in the world or those problems that we're engaging kids with on the engineering side.
Thank you, Tricia. And I think if I may add to Valerie's question and your response, that sometimes it might take baby steps, right, as we try these new ways of learning and interacting with our students, that what you were seeing there probably are students who may have had some time working on these different skills at the time of the video, right?
That is a really great point, and this is something that I definitely gave myself, was patient with myself, and gave myself the time to be very intentional with students and support students well, that even with baby steps, my experience in my own classroom as well as in classrooms around me is even baby steps change the classroom so much. It really is, I describe it as magic. So kids are so invested in what they're doing, just like you saw in the video. So the 3 dimensions, I think that what we're building to is my claim is that the 3 dimensions can be a great way to make STEM come alive in your classroom. And that's how the 2 of them can intersect. And I wanted you to be able to see some classroom examples and think about the practices so we can start to see how that particular dimension, if we focus our attention on giving students multiple opportunities to engage in these practices on both the science and engineering side, that it can enhance their achievement and their engagement and really support both STEM and NGSS initiatives. Flavio, is it okay if I move on to the next slide?
Yeah, just a second. Rosina, I think, was adding to the discussion on the chat window with regards to maybe applying some differentiated instruction to those who aren't as familiar with working with models. Tricia, back to you.
Oh, thank you. That is a great point. We did provide some differentiation, and at the end of the webinar, I can share a link to where this entire unit is posted, where you can read more about that. But the students were all, this particular video was from very early on. The state of Kentucky has been at this NGSS initiative for several years and using the NGSS standards for several years. But this video was actually recorded pretty early on in the process. And so all of these high school students were new to understanding the science and engineering practice of developing and using models as it is articulated in the NGSS. So with that, I'm going to move to the next slide. And again, just to remind everybody about the answer I shared the answer I shared to the question from the chat box, that the students were making their thinking visible, and they were making that thinking visible because they were trying to figure out and be able to explain a phenomenon, the phenomenon of the high school football player. So if we consider our progression of the practice of developing and using models again, notice the bullet points or elements of the practices that we noted from our previous discussion about the classroom video are focused on this upper row and middle row of this particular handout. The bullets at this blue arrow here, we could think about them as bullets that students could demonstrate using the engineering process. So to give students multiple opportunities to make sense and solve problems, I first designed instruction where students were using the models to deepen their understanding of the science and the system needed to understand the death of this teenager. Then students were challenged to take that understanding that they built from engaging in discourse and using those multiple models and leverage that understanding in their analysis of the merits and limitations of these models to design their own model that was a better fit or a better representation of how the system works. So let's consider a student example of this challenge to design a model that was a better fit. And for this, Flavio is going to share another short video. And this is a video of a student group and what their work was. And this is their prototype design that they shared via video with peers, both inside their classroom and actually across the country, so to get their feedback on their prototype design. So I'd love if you would view the video. Flavio would take us through that, and then we'll come back to the webinar.
Thank you, Tricia. So let's all click on the away button now to indicate that we're going away to watch this video. I may place the URL on the chat window, and there it is now. So enjoy watching that video. Click on the away button when you return so we may continue with our slides. Thank you. Okay, remember as you return to click on the Away button to indicate that you finished watching the video and you're back in the Blackboard screen. I see still a few of you working on the video. We'll pass the mic again back to Tricia. Tricia?
Thank you, Flavio. As people are rejoining us, let's think about how the instruction informative assessment in these classroom examples can support the understanding of another innovation in the NGSS, and that is that science and engineering are integrated into instruction. So let's consider the student argument and her prototype to better understand this innovation. In this video example, the student and her group used their developing understanding of the interacting components of a system, motivated by a personal desire to be able to explain how the high school football player died from drinking water in Gatorade. These students used this understanding to design a prototype that would serve as a better model, a better representation than the ones they used to develop this understanding. The use of science to inform the engineering design process is an integral aspect of engineering, according to the NGSS. In this example, students developed an ability to explain a system, the science side, that you can see on the left-hand side of this graphic organizer, and they used this understanding in engineering design that you can see on the right-hand side of this particular Venn diagram. It's the integration of the two together that became so powerful for students. And in this particular example, the students used technology they designed their prototype on those posters, and then they sent them to their peers and asked for feedback on their design before they then built their design and tested it. And so that video was at the very beginning of an ongoing revising and iterative process where the students not only made a better design, but also deepened their understanding of the science that you see on the left-hand side of this particular page. And so they leave that experience with a better understanding of the iterative process of design, but also a solid understanding of the science that they can use in multiple ways, both within their K-12 school years as well as beyond. In the NGSS, you'll notice that this particular science idea is talking about one system being made up of numerous parts. I chose the urinary system, well, actually we chose, I should rephrase. As a class, we chose to investigate the urinary system because we were trying to understand the death of the high school football player. And so based on that phenomenon that engaged students developed an understanding of the system and its components that they could then apply to other systems under study. So if we think about the integration of the three dimensions and the science understanding in this case was developed by applying all three of those dimensions. We've been focused on the practices, and I just, in that graphic organizer, focused on the disciplinary core ideas that are this part of the page. But the way that the students organized the thinking around that is that they looked at those aspects through the lens. They organized their thinking around structure and function, which is a cross-cutting concept. And we can more visually see the integration of those three dimensions in this case, in this particular graphic organizer, where students were first engaged using models and then developing on their own through the design process to understand this key science idea in living systems and to understand this science idea in the engineering domain. And they were using system and system models and structure and function as the cross-cutting concepts to organize that thinking. The final classroom example of the night is another example of engineering design and also how students leveraged technology in the science that they were learning and brought it all together. In this case, the students were working paired with a classroom, and a fourth grade classroom at the elementary school, and together the high schoolers in the fourth grade classroom were designing an invertebrate Olympic Games. And the fourth graders asked the high schoolers to design events that would be water events, which was very challenging. And so each group of high school students had to investigate which invertebrate would be a participant in this event and maintain it as part of in the classroom ecosystem as they were designing their event and testing it out. And then they had to create a pitch to send to the entire fourth grade, all of the fourth grade classes at our partnered elementary school, for there to be a vote. And the top two events were actually featured in our live Invertebrate Olympics that we held for the community, for our community around our school. So I would love for you to watch this, one of the arguments that one of the events that scored in the top two that we actually had live. And then I would love for us to come back together and think about, through the process of this Invertebrate Olympic Games, what practices, what science and engineering practices were the students engaged with?
Well, thank you, Tricia. Let's go ahead and click the away button. And here's the video on the chat window, the video link. Click on the video link, watch your video, and return to Blackboard. Okay, some of you have already finished watching the video. Click the away button again to indicate that you're back. Let's turn over back to Trish.
Thank you, Flavio. As participants come back, I'm going to ask that they use the clip art and put clip art on the practices that they feel students were primarily engaged with in the Invertebrate Olympic Games unit, with as much information that I've given you. So if you could place the clip art on that practice or practices that you feel like students were using the most, that were the most prominent. First, I I'm noticing that what we're starting to see with a very robust unit that has both engaging science tasks where students need to use science in design, packs a really powerful punch. And then when you add that component of leveraging the technology to share what is happening between the classrooms, that adds an additional element that not only engages students and allows them to be able to give each other feedback, to critique arguments, to communicate with each other in that evidence-based way, but it also prepares them, in my experience, more appropriately for this fast-paced, globally interconnected world that we live in. And so both the fourth grade and the high school students made videos that they shared with each other. They communicated with each other on a walkie-talkie app called Boxer. They communicated with each other and the Invertebrate Olympic Games president on Twitter. So we were quite connected and engaged in this unit over a period of about 6 weeks. And you can also see that in this particular example, Abby and her group were pitching their argument about why their event met the criteria and constraints. And ultimately, they were successful with that argument because their event was chosen as one that we featured. Again, which we also, as you can imagine, these events happen in a very small space, and we actually filled a gymnasium with parents and community members to view our Olympic Games. So we had an entire technology and engineering group that recorded each event and put it on a giant screen so that the whole audience could see a very exciting invertebrate Olympic competition. So let's pull it all together because we're at 12 minutes left in our webinar. And so the innovation that I really wanted us to think about is how all three dimensions, but the students being engaged through the science and engineering practices to figure out could be a way that NGSS and STEM could intersect. And so again, we have the NGSS and the innovation of engaging in science and engineering practices to deeply understand disciplinary and core ideas, including the disciplinary core ideas of engineering, and using those cross-cutting concepts to organize and connect that thinking. We've been talking a lot about the framework document that is the vision for the NGSS, and that is where this vision of the three dimensions, of the role of phenomena in engineering design, and how science and engineering should be integrated together. That's where all of this is described. And that vision document was used to write the next generation science standards, which articulates in detail at each grade band what that vision can look like. And where we are today is in this area where we are designing curriculum, instruction, assessments, shifting pre-service education, and engaging in professional learning. So my argument in this webinar tonight is that to implement these standards, a way to do all of these things in this final column is to consider STEM as the framework for doing that, and vice versa, that for teachers that really want to implement STEM successfully, consider the innovations of the framework. Again, based on decades of research as well as the latest research on how kids learn, that together it's a very powerful team. So I'd like us to leave and wind down the webinar today thinking about our last interactive task. We've been concentrating on making sense making, figuring out. So what does it mean to figure out? If you could please use your clip art and place clip art in any of the boxes that you feel like articulate and communicate what it means to figure out. I'm going to turn this over to Flavia.
Thank you, Tricia. You should have the toolbar available. The clip art is the very last button on the vertical bar. Use it to respond to this question. Thank you.
I love what I'm seeing on the screen, Flavio, because this maybe could be considered by some to be a trick question. All of these are articulations of what it means to figure out. And as you look through these, you can see how science and engineering are coming together, and thinking about with the classroom examples, how integrating technology and math can bring this all together and prepare kids for those next step opportunities. Thank you so much for your participation in that. I'm going to turn it back over to Wendy to finish this out.
Thanks, Tricia. That was a wonderful dive into looking for the STEM in NGSS and looking at NGSS and STEM. So this slide that I put up is very important to me because when I work with educators across the country around STEM, and I'm sure some of you have encountered this, sometimes there are what are called STEM activities are simply building, but they're not reflective of what Trish just emphasized, that engineering design needs to be informed by the principles of science, or else it's purely just an activity. And I think that she did an excellent job of pointing out how the disciplinary core ideas are embedded within what they're doing in engineering design. So one is informed by the other. And so I put a question here because as you think about unit development or lesson development, and you start with an engaging phenomena that Trish talked about that elicits numerous student questions, look at your storyline and ask yourself, where would the engineering design process make sense and be informed by the disciplinary core ideas? And in your collection, I placed an excellent article that is entitled How to Develop an Engineering Design Task. And it takes you through 7 steps and it's embedded within the NGSS, taking a look at the standard you want to hit before you even embark on the engineering design process. So I highly recommend that article. It's in that collection for you. And the last slide I have is just really a push to read Appendix A, because I think it has a wealth of information. It's in your collection, and that science and engineering are needed to address their major challenges, to make sure that students are equipped to go into the workforce and solve the problems of the future. And I think that Trish did a brilliant job of really taking a red pen and going through the dimensions of NGSS and showing you the embedded aspects of STEM that are in there, and they're very much intertwined. And I think if there's any last questions, I know we're pretty much right on the dot of almost 8, so we can take a few questions. And you've been an excellent audience. To have 43 people stick with us for an hour and a half is pretty good, so thank you. And Trish, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll pause here for a couple of minutes to see if there are questions from the audience. We'd like to invite our participants to stay just a few minutes, so we'd love to get your feedback about this program. So we'll be displaying the survey URL here in a few minutes. Well, Trish and Wendy, I don't see questions on the chat window. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Wendy Binder and Tricia Shelton from NSTA, for this presentation about NGSS and STEM, 2 converging paths. Let's give them a round of applause using our emoticons on the top left corner of the participants window. And thank you very much also to you, our audience. Thank you for joining us on this warm evening at the beginning of December to discuss the convergence of NGSS and STEM. Let's also thank our sponsor for today's web seminar, the GE Foundation, for their generous support for this program, and the NSTA management team further support of NSTA web seminars. With this, we would like to close out and invite those who are participating and watching this program as an archive to also check out the forums and the collection provided through this program. Everyone have a pleasant evening.